Hello and welcome to lesson 14, looking at symmetrical families for GCSE Sociology families. So I want to get straight into this, so let's go. Okay, so here's your do now task. I want to go over the homework that we would have done on page 71. So please turn to that. It was just 5 multiple choice questions reflecting on the reading that you have done. So let's have a look at what these are. So identify the sociological perspective that Young and Wilmot wrote from. You have a choice of feminist, Marxist, or functionalist. And I even told you at the end of the last video that it was indeed functionalist. Question number 2, identify the sociological perspective that Oakley wrote from. This is something which we talked about in the last video, so again, this shouldn't be too hard for you to know that Oakley wrote from a feminist perspective. Then identify the time frame that Young and Wilmot saw stratified diffusion as operating in. So this is when that sort of stratification that is happening. When is this changing? So when is this going to diffuse? Is it going to happen in pre-industrialized society, early industrial society, or the future or now? So they said it was going to be in the future or now, given that the study was in 1973. Identify the overall argument that Young and Wilmot make in their study. Is it that conjugal roles are becoming increasingly equal, that conjugal roles remain based on gender, so women doing most of the work, there is no move to symmetry, or conjugal roles are a thing of the past and will be replaced by labor-saving devices? And they argued that conjugal roles are becoming increasingly equal. And then identify the argument, the overall argument that Oakley makes in response to Young and Wilmot. Is it that conjugal roles are becoming increasingly equal, that they remain based on gender, or that it is a thing of the past? And they say it is still based on gender, where women are doing most of the work. There is almost no move to symmetry. Okay, so today, what are we looking at? We want to know, to what extent have conjugal roles become symmetrical? So you will need to identify what exactly, how far, or whether we have actually reached the point of symmetry. So there's a few things we're going to do. So there's we're going to discuss this with sensitivity. We're going to do a reading where there's going to be some multiple choice questions. You'll need to know the attitudes from 1970. There'll be a little survey which was going to be done in class, so it'll be a bit tricky to do a class survey with, I guess, just me. And then a reading from an LGBT plus couple, and then some homework. Here we go. So there's a clip that I want to show you from 1970s London. Now, it is a lot longer. We're only going to watch the first 5 minutes. I think it goes for about 30 minutes. So you're more than welcome to go and look at the rest. It is quite good. I do recommend it. So we're going to watch a clip that looks at how women felt about conjugal roles in the 1970s, and you need to answer these questions. So what attitudes seem out of date? What attitudes can you recognize today? What points do they make about housework, and in what ways is the 1970s Peckham represented in this documentary different from Peckham as you know it today? And do women in this video seem to be living in symmetrical families? Now you need to explain your answer for the last 2 questions. Now if you are doing this by yourself, the video here is actually embedded in the PowerPoint, so you can just click on play. You just click on play, and then there's the whole thing is there. You only need to watch the first 5 minutes. It is also on YouTube here as well, called People for Tomorrow by Selma James. Our Time Is Coming. We're just gonna watch it here on YouTube.
Who am I? Like millions of women everywhere, I'm a typist. I'm a housewife, a mother, and I've been a factory worker. For 25 years, I've been involved in revolutionary politics, concentrating on the liberation of women in the US where I grew up, and later in the West Indies, and England. I am one of those people who have always listened to women, assuming that what they are is not necessarily what they can be.
I set my clock to alarm at 6 a.m. in the morning, gets up at 6 a.m., do some of my housework, leave home at 8:30 a.m., reach work at 9, finish at 3:30 p.m., reach home about 4:30 p.m., and start the cooking, and the rest of work I do off then until 6 or 7 in the evening for supper.
We work an 8-hour day here. I'm going home now to do some shopping. I don't have dinner lunch. I have a cup of tea if I'm lucky. I come back to work, I do my work. Then I go home and do my housework, get the tea prepared. How on earth?
Working women have two jobs, the one they get paid for and the one they don't, the running of the home.
There's no profession or trade in the world where anyone works as hard as they do. It's long hours, and which just for bed and board. I mean, if industry could exploit women the same in factories and that, and produce from females as males do, and in the condition that society imposes upon women, I mean, it's fantastic.
I mean, in a house, you can't expect a man to do the washing. You can't expect him to make beds or anything like that, can you? Hey?
My father used to make the decisions at home, and Mum used to agree, more or less, because he said so. He was sort of brought up in a different age, really. He doesn't believe a man should do anything now.
You've both got to share everything. It's no good expecting the woman to do everything. I didn't want to live like my mum and dad lived. My mum doing everything, my dad doing nothing.
Yeah, I used to say, why don't you just sort of get him to get his own boiled egg in the morning, or why don't you put it on when he comes down? She used to creep around the kitchen and listen, and then she'd get me to go into the hall and listen when he went from the bathroom into the bedroom, and know that from in the bedroom down the stairs, putting his clothes on, that would take about 3 minutes. So she put the egg in the water then. And I used to sort of say to her, what?
Mine used to come in at night and hold his feet out with his boots on and grunt. Sometimes he didn't even grunt, and that was a signal for you to take his boots off.
Yes.
Well, I mean, it happens all the time. My father puts his teacup down on the table and just sort of looks. And if you don't catch his eye, then he sort of will make a noise to say that he wants another cup of tea. Yeah, that's right. Yes, just make a noise to indicate that he would please like another cup of tea. But he never says a word.
Yeah.
And when I've questioned this, my mother would say, "Oh, he's done that for years. You won't change him now."
Members of the Peckham Women's Liberation Group. These are the families that shaped them. They reject not only the extreme domination their mothers knew, but all domination by men.
I prefer to think of man as being more dominant of the two. I like to think of the woman as dependent on the man. I think she keeps her femininity that way. Yeah, I think she would definitely lose her if it was the other way around.
When we got married, when I was 21, I really wanted to wear a wedding ring. Before we got married, I used to sit on the tube train coming back from work thinking, oh, it itches, this finger. I can't wait to get that wedding ring on it.
Even I, when I first got married, before I got married, was looking forward to actually catching a man, to actually being married. And this is very important to girls. I mean, the whole conditioning for women to catch a man by the age of 20, if they haven't caught one by the age of 21, they've had it.
When I was 17, 18, 19, all I thought about was getting married and having children. I thought it was going to be the most fantastic thing in the world. It isn't until sort of almost about a year ago, when I first thought of this seriously, that I suddenly realised that what was it that I was sort of dreaming about, because it hasn't come true. I've got married, I've got kids, but the dream life isn't there. It's boring.
The dream life, the myth of fulfillment through marriage and motherhood, is shattering to bits. The modern individual, if she is a woman, is cramped and stifled by the institution of the family as we know it.
Okay, that's where we will leave it. Okay, so very, very interesting in terms of what was being discussed. Looking at this from the 1970s, you can kind of see how there is some big differences in life today, especially if we go back to these questions. Now, you need to answer these. So what attitudes seem out of date? What attitudes can you recognize today? What are the points you then make about housework? What ways is Peckham represented in this documentary, and what about today? Now, I think for the most part, some of these questions should be quite easy to answer. given that some of these attitudes seem out of date. Even the last bit, so women thinking that if they're not married by the time they're 21, then they've had it. I think of this same attitude, though, has been around for a very, very, very long time. If you are familiar with Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, you know that this idea of getting married and how much emphasis this places on... Ooh, my speaker's gone funny. Just unplug it. How much emphasis this is placed on a woman's life is plainly quite ridiculous. So you would find this very much less so today. I don't imagine there's too many of you thinking that, oh my gosh, there'll be something wrong with me if I'm not married by the time I'm 21. Given that there is, I mean, it's a lot harder probably to find women who are married at 21 than there are to find single women at 21. So so a lot of the answers should be quite straightforward in that regard. So once you've done that, push on to have these conjugal roles become symmetrical. Okay, here we go. So the sort of like wanting to look at what it is like for us as a class. Now, my intention behind this was to do a bit of a survey. Obviously, that's not going to happen. So I guess I'll talk about and have a guess at what your situation is, and I'll talk a little bit about mine. So, identify the type of household that we live in. So, I live in a mixed gender household. So, I grew up with both my parents. I would probably say that in Peckham, my understanding is a single household is actually quite high. So I would probably say I'm probably in the minority there. So is domestic labor completed by people who live in the household? I would say absolutely yes. If you answered mixed gender, and yes, please identify who or the people who do most of the domestic household. So obviously, if you live in a single household home, it's going to be obvious who's doing it. So if you live in a single with a single mum, then obviously it's going to be the adult female. Or if you live with a single dad, it's obviously the adult male. But who do the most domestic if you're in a mixed gender? This is hard for me to identify because my parents were both teachers. They're both dual in that regard. And with that, there was a lot of shared responsibility. So when it came to the associated let's say feminine tasks such as cooking, that still didn't really have much of an impact because my dad, I mean, was quite good at cooking. So we always looked forward to when he was cooking pizzas or when he was cooking spaghetti. Whereas I guess when it came to the more feminine tasks, perhaps my mum did more cleaning, but then my dad did the majority of the yard work. So there's a big balance there. A big balance to the point where I would say a lot of the financial decisions, which are the more important decisions, were actually being made by my mum, the person who was in control of the bills and making sure that they were paid on time, in that sort of allocation of the accounts and going to the bank. I think that was my mum, and that is what is more considered to be the man's task. So for me, in my experience, is that it was very much split in terms of who was doing what. So it's hard for me to actually say who was doing the most. I would really be challenged to do that. And for me, who grew up in that, obviously I think that was very fair and equitable, so I would want to pass that on then if at some point I then move into having a family of my own. My guess, though, is that for, I guess, outside of dual earner relationships, if your mum is still living primarily at home, then obviously she would be doing majority of the housework. And I think that this is what is the reflection of that is society. I don't really know. It's hard for me to be able to do a survey with just myself here. So what about national research? Fortunately, we can rely on national research. So Puggy here, he says that he wants us to go back to page 70 and look at what the ONS stats suggest. Now, I did mention this briefly, so I'm going to flick to page 70, which is that women still do the majority of domestic labor. Now, I did mention that last lesson. So, to what extent are findings similar? I'd say that for me, it's not. Which data gives us the national picture, our mini survey or the ONS? So, obviously, the ONS gives us the national picture. our mini survey would be just our class or me. So obviously, if I want the national picture, I can't rely on just my own experience. That's anecdotal evidence, which is kind of dismissed. Overall, what does this suggest about the issue of symmetry in conjugal roles in families in 2018? I think it suggests that like there is this, we are heading towards symmetry. Whilst you still have single parent households, you won't get that. But if you get mixed gender households where both parents are working, I fully believe that this is where we're heading, to a time of symmetry. What about same-sex relationships, though? So it's always been about opposite genders. What about same-sex relationships? And this is the argument that the feminists put forward, that, oh, look, if if women were or men were in same-sex relationships, this wouldn't be an issue. Well, let's have a look, because they might think that you're freed from heterosexual gendered expectations. Let's actually have a look. So I have here an article, a blog written by this person here, Lindsay King Miller. Here we go. So I'm going to read it, and we will respond to it at the end. There's a toy stegosaurus in the middle of our dining room floor. It has been there for at least a day. I'm looking at it as I write this, and it's looking back at me, daring me to get up and throw it in the basket to where it belongs. It would only take 2 seconds, but the dinosaur knows I'm not going to move from this chair, because if I do, I'll start putting away jackets strewn over furniture, and then I'll remember to start the dishwasher, and then, before I know it, I'll have an hour of peace while my partner is putting our 2-year-old daughter to bed downstairs, and this article won't be any closer to done. Being in an approximately same-sex marriage, my partner Charlie is genderqueer. I occasionally feel a flicker of smugness when I see yet another study on how straight men rely on their hapless partners to manage the day-to-day grind of running a household. But the schadenfreude is short-lived. Our same-sex couples' division of labour may be more equitable than that of heterosexual parents, but equal doesn't always mean fair. Being a family with 2 mums, or a mum and a butch dad who gave birth, in our case, simply means that twice as many people are being shortchanged by this country's unconscionable, lack of support for women who parent. In hetero marriages, a major shortcoming seems to be that communication, at least when it comes to household tasks, is unidirectional. Countless women note that their husbands never do chores without being asked. I will admit this is one place queer marriages kick ass up and down the block. As a queer couple, our marriage is an ongoing conversation. Who is feeling burned out? Who needs something taken off their plate this week? What chores are hanging over our heads and stressing us out? And what do we each need to feel rejuvenated? In short, we are very intentional about the never-ending calculus of needs and resources that must be balanced to maintain our family's stability. But it doesn't matter. In 2017, making a living, running a household and raising children is too much work for 2 people, even if both are striving to pull their weight. There is never enough time to do all the things that need doing. In hetero households, it's common for couples' housework gap to increase after they become parents. Women typically take on the bulk of the cooking and cleaning during maternity leave, and things never really shift back towards congruity. Things have played out differently for us, however. There's still a gendered element to the way we share the work of parenting and household chores. I'm the femme in a butch-femme relationship and do a lot of the feminized household labor. I wash cloth diapers, take out the trash, and talk about definitely trying to vacuum sometime this week. See, reading's hard. Though my partner does more of the cooking because he's better at it, and yet somehow we're both exhausted all the time. Too many women are still living in the mindset that if men shouldered a reasonable proportion of the load, everything will be manageable and fine. And while straight men en masse need to get together before their wives die of stress-related illness and leave them with a fitted bedsheet that will never be folded properly again, parental burnout is actually a more pervasive cultural problem than anything that can be solved with a heart-to-heart and chore chart. The answer is not just for men to take on more, although that's a step in the right direction. The conversation cannot begin with, how do we make sure it all gets done? It has to start with, in a time of rampant wealth disparity and vanishing social services, it can't all get done. What are our real priorities and what can we let go? Or if you're me, how much of this mess can I shove into a guest room and shut the door? Until a six-figure book deal falls into my lap, our family is learning the juggling act of moving the mess around to wherever it will be least in the way. It still stings to compare our household with the ideals espoused by sitcoms and social media. There's another whole essay in how Instagram and Pinterest are reviving seriously retrograde gender roles and standards. But acknowledging that we are never going to close that gap is the only way mothers can have any semblance of free time, work-life balance, or emotional well-being. We need to demand less from ourselves and more from our society. Well. So let's look at these questions. Here we go. Does the author say that her married relationship has a more equal division of labor compared to straight relationships in general? Does the author argue that being in an LGBTQ relationship will automatically create more equal gendered divisions of labor? The author states that communication in many straight relationships is unidirectional, one way, and that in her queer relationship, the marriage has a constant conversation. Explain how better communication might enable more equal domestic division of labor in relationships. So I guess this question, I agree. Really, it comes down to communication. That's it. If you are tired of doing something, or if you're finding something difficult, it's not hard to communicate and work through that. If you're in a relationship where you are unable to communicate with each other, then you're going to have issues. That's just it. So the problem, I think, isn't gender. The problem is communication. She sort of makes that argument. Does the author state any relationship, LGBTQ or straight, can cope with the demands of domestic life and professional life? And we need to demand less from ourselves and more from our society. That's a statement which is made right there at the end. Which perspectives does this clothing statement resonate with? So is it functionalist, is it Marxist, or is it feminist? Interesting. We need to demand less from ourselves and more from our society. Now, many people will say, well, if I'm part of a society, it's not my responsibility to do your housework. And that I'm personally of that position. So I would disagree quite strongly with her and go, well, no, that's your responsibility. But I think her argument isn't at the individual like myself. I think it's more at the actual functions of society. I think she's talking more perhaps about the work-life constraints that's going on there. I think that you need to probably have a guess at that as well. So there are the questions. You need to take the time to answer all of those. Okay, let's move on. Here we go. And yes, there is some homework. Nice, simple, easy homework. Prepare a two-sided argument. So I'm not telling you to write one, I'm telling you to prepare one for the two 12-mark questions for your walkthrough mock exam. Okay, so we're not doing the walkthrough mock exam. Obviously, this isn't going to happen. Prepare a two-sided argument for these two 12-mark questions. So I'm guessing, if I am getting this right, that you will need to do a 12-mark question looking at conjugal roles. Now, if I can find it, that would be excellent. See if I can find it. I think it is back on, it was the LO. I'll just quickly flick back, back we go. On slide 2, I think it was. No, slide. Oh no, I overshot, my bad. What is it we're talking about? Okay, here it is. To what extent have conjugal roles become symmetrical? I think that's what it is. So I want you to prepare a 12-mark question looking at this question. To what extent have conjugal roles become symmetrical? Not write one, prepare one. Okay, so you will need to probably do a little bit of research on yourself, perhaps to find some more recent statistics if you can find some. Don't mind if they're American as well. American is okay. You could go Australian if you want. Best to stick with Western countries because we are in a Western context. However, it might be worth talking about what's going on in some developing nations. I think one of my pictures I actually chose was from one looking at what was happening in India. So in terms of what the family situation, in particular for women in India. So that's where we're going to leave it until I upload the last PowerPoints for this unit, and we are then done. So until then, hope you guys have a good weekend.